Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to you, wherever you are tuning in around the world. Once again, you are with us for another episode of Stories and Myths. I am your host, Craig Von Buzik. I'm here with my co-host, the venerable John C. Farrell. And how are you this beautiful evening? This is a crisp, beautiful evening.
Yes, I'm doing well. Came home, watched one of my sons jump on the trampoline. I think he's the only person who can break a sweat in the cold weather, but he came off the trampoline and he was sweating profusely. I'm like, all right, go inside, take a shower. It's nice to hang out with my son for a little bit.
The temperature in my car, the external temperature said like 45 degrees, which
Mine was in the 40s. I don't remember exactly.
For the Charlotte area is pretty chilly. Especially, any time of year, but this time of year. I guess we're coming into the cooler time of year.
I did see in Boone that they got their first snowfall of the year or of the season.
Erie, Pennsylvania, my hometown, also had the first 2 days of snow this week. So it's that time of year, right?
So
we're in November.
And
so at any rate, by the way, happy birthday to you.
Well, thank you. It was last Monday or this past Sunday, and so it was a great time. Got to spend some time with my family and a lot of friends that came by, trick-or-treating and all that jazz, and it was good. It's
good. Well, what do we have on tap for this week?
Well, we're going to talk about Harry Truman and his relationship with Eddie Jacobson and how that kind of their relationship and their bond helped formed the rebirth of Israel.
And let me just say that this story is told in detail in my book, I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel. And it was actually the story that caused me to write that book to begin with. It was the story of Harry and Eddie that I learned in the 1980s. A friend of mine gave me a cassette tape from a group called Friends of Israel. And the speaker told the story of this relationship between Harry and his Jewish friend, Eddie Jacobson, and how it impacted America and Israel and the world. So let's dive in.
Oh, absolutely. So let's just get right to the beginning. So how did Eddie Jacobson meet Harry S. Truman?
Well, Harry had been working in downtown Kansas City. He lived in Independence, Missouri, which is a suburb of Kansas City. But he didn't see himself as a farmer. He didn't want to be a farmer. And yet his father had him working as a farmer on the family farm. But then Harry was able to convince his dad to let him go get a job. So Harry got a job working at a bank in downtown Kansas City. And down the block from that bank was a clothing store. And he would stop in there to look at, ties and shirts and shoes and socks and all the things that a man would look at. And he got to know one of the clerks there. And it was a kid who was younger than him, a young.
Hey, Craig, we're having technical problems. I can't hear you. You've gone out.
Can you hear me all right, Don?
You're you're frozen.
I'm frozen.
Yeah, you're got that kind of technical Max Headroom kind of voice.
Well, I can see you perfectly fine, so I don't know that it's on my side.
If you're watching this,
I can see you. I can hear you. My
picture of me looks fine, but the picture of you is frozen on my screen.
All right. If you're watching right now, could you let us know if the signal is coming through all right? From my side, it looks perfectly fine, but John is having problems.
Yeah, you're good. You're good now.
Okay.
So,
Well, let's continue, and
okay.
we'll stop if we need to, but
Okay.
hopefully we're good. At any rate, Eddie and Harry developed a friendship, and they used to hang out together in downtown Kansas City. Well, just not too long after that, World War I broke out, and America eventually entered the war. And so Eddie and Harry both signed up to be part of the war effort. Because Harry was older, he was put into a leadership position very quickly. And so they were sent off to boot camp in Oklahoma. And while they were there, Harry started to show his leadership abilities. You know, those were innate in him. And the officers noticed that. And so they gave him a job, and that was to run the local canteen for that part of this massive, sprawling base. And they had 3 or 4 canteens that were run by the soldiers. But what Harry found out very quickly was that most of these canteens couldn't stay open. They would run out of money and they'd have to close down, much to the chagrin of the commanding officers. Now, these canteens were for things that the Army didn't provide. So things like soda pop and tobacco and shoelaces and stationery, things like that. And so Harry said, well, I need to find somebody to help me to run this because he had never really run a business before other than the farm. Well, he knew his buddy Eddie Jacobson had experience running businesses. So he brought Eddie in and he said, what do we need to do so that we can not only keep this open, but it can prosper? And Eddie said, it's all about cash flow. We need to have enough money so that in the times when people aren't buying, we don't get shut down. And in the other times, we'll have such great products that people will come to our store and not to the other stores. And so Eddie said, why don't we borrow, I think it was $2 from everybody in our division and tell them that we will pay them back with interest. And they did. And everybody gave the $2. And so Harry and Eddie had enough money to go out and buy really great stuff that people wanted. And then, of course, what Eddie said was true. And so suddenly they were flush with money. They were easily able to pay everybody back with interest. Plus, they had a big pot of profits beyond that. Well, they did so well that they ended up opening up a barber shop. So it was like, let's try and figure out all the different things that the soldiers want. Well, that caught the attention of the officers. And they said, this Harry Truman guy is obviously talented. So let's promote him. And that was the beginning of Harry's climb up the ladder. So his friendship with Eddie opened the doors for him to start climbing up the ladder, because once they got out of the war, he came out as a captain. And so that was something that gave him clout down the road.
Awesome. So is that what happened during, so was this basic training or boot camp?
Same thing.
Same thing. Okay. So how did World War I change him or change them?
Well, you can't go through the hell of war without being changed.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them grew, and both of them really, saw the horrors of war. And so they had to face those things and kind of leave their childhood behind. Now, by this time, Harry was 30 years old, and so he was a little bit older, but Eddie was in his mid-20s, and he was a very gentle soul his whole life. And so war makes an impact. And so that was one thing. But then with Harry, he came to realize that he knew how to lead. And it became something that he understood for the rest of his life. And so when he left Europe and came back to the United States, he came back with tremendous confidence. And that confidence carried with him throughout his life. And he really had wanted to go to college, but his father had lost all of his money, almost lost the entire farm in just making some poor, business decisions. And so they never had the money to send Harry to college. So Harry was one of the only presidents, at least in the 20th century. I think he was the only president that didn't have college experience.
Oh, wow.
And but he said, my college was on the battlefields of France, and that was enough college for a lifetime.
Awesome. So what did Harry and Eddie decide to do as soon as they returned to Kansas City?
Well, it's an interesting thing because they both came back not wanting to go and get jobs. They wanted to go into business. And Harry went to Eddie. They had lunch together, and Harry said, we really made a great team running that canteen back in Oklahoma. How about if we open up our own men's clothing store? And Eddie was like, I love that idea. And so they rented a really nice storefront that was the first floor of a high rise in downtown Kansas City. And two of the biggest hotels, the Mulebach, and I don't remember what the name of the other one was, but the two biggest hotels with big convention centers were like within a block, or one was even like right across the street. And so they knew that they would be getting all the conventioneers coming in. They'd be getting the business people from downtown. And then the other thing about Kansas City is this was the jazz era. And Kansas City was a boom town at that point. And so they got business all the way into the late hours of the day of people who would come downtown to gamble, to go to the bars, to go to the theaters, to go to the movie houses, which were just starting to open up. And so it was a boom time for the first year or so after they opened up. But the problem was that there was a post-war recession as the country was moving from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. Mm-hmm. Everything kind of collapsed. And the things that, it really affected the farmers. And of course, Kansas City's right there in the grain belt. And so when the farms are affected, the businessmen are affected. And it trickled down. And finally, they couldn't keep the store open, which was a tragedy because they were doing extremely well the first year. But then the second year, it just dried up and they had to go bankrupt.
So what'd they do after their business failed? You froze again. You're frozen and I can't hear you again. Hey, if you're watching this and you can hear me, let us know in the comments. And if you could hear Craig or not, let me know in the comments, and so we can try to figure out what's going on our end. Thank you.
Can you hear me, John?
I can hear. Yeah, Gary Sesanowski just said, I can hear you, John, but Craig is frozen.
How about now?
I can hear you now perfectly.
Okay. Well, let's keep going. Okay. So, the ticker is still going on the live feed. So thank you, Gary. Appreciate that feedback. Mm-hmm. So what happened is that a lot of former officers began running for political office, which happens after every war. And thank you, Gary. I appreciate that. And so the son of the political boss, the Pendergast machine, it was called, the Democratic machine in Kansas City, the son of the big boss, went to war with Harry and really admired his leadership. And so he went to his father and said, Harry would make an excellent politician. And so the two of them came to the store as Harry was behind the desk reading a book because there was just hardly any business. And they said, we want you to run for a county judge position. Now, in Kansas City, it wasn't a judge like a legal judge. It was like a county commissioner.
Okay.
There were 3 county commissioners. It's just they called them judges for whatever reason. And so they wanted Harry to run for one of those positions. And they said they would back him. And Harry said, well, I'll have to think about it. The truth of the matter is, Harry had wanted to run for political office for years. He and his father had been involved helping to organize the Democratic Party and to make sure, the get out the vote type thing was going on. And Harry had gotten a job as a postmaster for a while, a political job because of his connections. And so he was just telling them that so that he wouldn't appear too eager. But inside he was like, yes, this is the opportunity I've been looking for. And so after a couple of days of pretending that he was thinking about it, he reached out to them and said, yes, I will run for office. And so now Eddie is off selling shirts and Harry begins his political office career. He won the race and then he just started building from there. He served for, I think, 3 terms altogether. And then he decided to run for United States Senate in Kansas City. Nobody thought that he would win, but he did. And but by this point, not the father of his friend, but his uncle, who had kind of taken over as the big political boss, had gotten in trouble. He had spent over $1 million gambling on horses.
Oh, wow.
He had evaded his taxes. Well, a lot of people in Washington called Truman the king of Pendergastia because Pendergast was the big boss. And they said he won the election in a corrupt manner, which was not at all true, at least not from Harry's perspective and Harry's involvement. But he came into the Senate tinged by that. And so FDR would not touch Harry. He looked at Harry as damaged goods. And Harry had to kind of force his way into a meeting with the president. President glad-handed him and smiled and talked. It was supposed to be a 15-minute meeting, but after 5 minutes, FDR pushed him out the door and basically took Truman for granted. He knew that Truman would vote for the New Deal policies. And so it was like, we know we can count on Truman's vote, but we're not going to give Truman any kind of political patronage. And that's what is the bread and butter of senators and representatives. And so Truman was starting to get disgusted with this about halfway through his term. And he started complaining about it, but FDR wouldn't budge. And FDR actually wanted the governor of Kansas or of Missouri to be the next Democratic senator and to beat Truman. So FDR got behind Truman's opponent, which is crazy that later Truman becomes the vice president to FDR, but through Truman's entire first term, FDR didn't give him the time of day and didn't give him any patronage. All the patronage went through the governor, which really is not what is supposed to happen, but that's, when you're president, you can do what you're going to do.
Right.
And so everybody said, that, by the way, Pendergast he went to jail for his tax evasion and other crimes. And so everybody said, there's no way Truman can be reelected. He's damaged. Well, Truman said to his wife, he said, I don't care what they say. I believe I'm the right person for the job. I'm not tainted by this, and I'm going to run again. And so he did, and he won, which is pretty remarkable that he beat the governor of Missouri and ended up becoming senator in his own right, because he had very little help this time around because the political boss was behind bars. Now, his buddy, the nephew of the boss, helped out, but most of it was just plumb hard work on Truman's part.
Right.
And he was elected. And so when he walked out onto the Senate floor for the first time after being reelected in his own right, he got a standing ovation from the other senators. And from then on, he was looked on with respect. And so what happened is that the World War II broke out, and because Truman had been both a business person, a politician who dealt with contracts, and a veteran, he was very aware of the potential for graft and corruption in the military-industrial complex, which we deal with to this day. Absolutely. And Truman was a man of integrity. He was a Bible-believing Christian, and he believed that he was a patriot. And so he saw that there was this opportunity for corruption. So he took it upon himself in his own car, which if you ever go to the Harry Truman Presidential Library, you can see this actual car in the library that he drove with his own gas money. I would imagine there must have been some sort of a, petty cash that he used as a senator, but it was his own car, putting mileage on his own car. And he drove all around the country, and he would show up at these factories unannounced and say, "I'm Senator Truman, and I want you to give me the full tour, and I want to see your books." And he found out that there was all kinds of corruption happening. And he found out there was all kinds of waste. He would see items that should have been in a warehouse sitting out, rusting in the rain, wood that should have been covered that was out getting all twisted and warped, and other things like that. He saw workmen who were just sitting around, and these were people that had government contracts who were supposed to be building items for the war effort. And it was, this is what happens when you throw a bunch of money without a bunch of accountability. Human nature comes into play, and there will be a certain element that'll just take the easiest route. And Truman knew this to be the truth. And so he went out there and came back and made a speech on the floor of the Senate saying there's corruption and we need to clean it up. Well, FDR and the White House were actually very upset at Truman for this, because he didn't clear it with them. But he was like, you know what? After how you've treated me, I don't care if you're upset. I'm going to speak for my constituents, and I'm going to speak for the American people. Well, Truman called for a committee to be formed to oversee the industrial military complex. Well, at first, FDR was like, this is a bad idea, because he remembered the committee that was formed during the Civil War by the Congressional Committee for Oversight of the War, which was all kinds of bureaucracy and a total headache for Abraham Lincoln the whole time. In fact, I think it was Robert E. Lee who said that this committee was like he had another army that he was able to use, because they so hindered the Union war effort that it was like having an extra Confederate army. Wow. And I'm paraphrasing, but it was along those lines. So at any rate, FDR didn't like the idea, but it was actually the chief of staff that came to him, George C. Marshall, came to him and said, listen, it's going to happen. It's better if it happens under our friends than under our enemies. And Harry is our friend. So let's go ahead and let do what Congress is supposed to do, which is oversee the federal branch of the government. And so they started this committee, and it actually became known colloquially as the Truman Committee. Truman was very fair, but he was tough. And he held these industrialists and the military, he held their feet to the fire. And he along with the committee, they would do these spot checks around the country, and then they'd hold these hearings at major hotels in major cities around the country, and they'd bring these people in and put them under the magnifying glass. And he ended up saving millions and millions of dollars, so much so that Time magazine put him on the cover as a champion for the American people. And that was the beginning of his rise into a place of being considered for the vice presidency.
So before he became president, what was his position on the return of Jews to Eretz Israel?
He was pro-Jewish. He believed that the Jews were given this land by God as the promised land. He understood that they had lived in the land for more than 3,000 years, unbroken. There have always been Jews in the land. Now, they were not a majority at times, not because they didn't want to be, but because they were pushed out and then they were kept out. Had they had the opportunity, they would have flocked back to their homeland like homing pigeons, because you could take the promised land or take the Jew out of the promised land, but you can't take the promised land out of the heart of the Jews. So every year at Passover, they would end the Passover meal by saying, "Next year in Jerusalem." That's how much it was a part of their heart. Until they were able to get back to Jerusalem. So Harry Truman was in favor of the return of the Jews to Israel. He was in favor of the Balfour Declaration, and he looked on it as not only a British promise, but he understood, and I cover this in depth in I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel. Truman understood that it was not only the British that promised Palestine to the Jews after World War I, it was the Americans, because the British were having a hard time. The British government was having a hard time pushing it through because, sadly, because of some assimilated Jews who were nervous that if the Jews got their promised land, they thought that they would be kicked out of England and said, "Go back to your promised land," which the British never wanted to do that, and to this day have never done that. So it was just a fear that they allowed to consume them, but it helped to block the initial Balfour Declaration. And it actually sadly whittled down the promise and made it so vague that it caused a lot of the problems that have been there between the Arabs and the Jews to this day, which is really a tragedy, but it is what it is.
Right.
So what happened is that Chaim Weizmann, who was kind of like the Benjamin Franklin of the Jewish Zionist movement, reached out to Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was Jewish, and asked if he would go to President Wilson, who was president at the time during World War I, and ask if they would support the Balfour Declaration to help get it passed in Britain. And Frankfurter did that. Wilson considered it, and Wilson approved it. And we need to remember that Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian pastor, and he was a restorationist. He believed the Jews needed to be restored to the Holy Land in order for Jesus to return. And so, but he also saw it as the right thing to do, the just thing to do. And, you know, Wilson, with his 14 points, part of what he wanted to do was to restore indigenous people to their own land and get colonialism out of these lands. And so for him, he saw the Jews as being indigenous, and he saw that the Arabs were also indigenous, but they had a ton of land. And so there was a group of Arabs in the western part of Palestine, but there was also plenty of other land for the Arabs as well. And so they saw the Jordan River as the dividing line: Jewish to the west, Arab to the Transjordan, which now is the nation of Jordan. And they saw that as a two-state solution. So this whole thing today of this argument of a two-state solution, that was decided after World War I in the Paris Peace Accord and in the San Remo Agreement. So it was the British that really caused the division that led to the problems that we're still seeing to this day. So at any rate, it was Harry Truman that was in favor of this as a senator, and he always voted to support the Jewish cause and the Zionist cause.
So, how did Eddie Jacobson get pulled into the question of the Jews' return to the Promised Land?
Well, Eddie was not a Zionist. He was like I said, he was a gentle soul, mild mannered, and he just kind of was like, I don't really want to get involved in politics. That's Harry's thing. But what happened is that after 6 million Jews were murdered during the Nazi Holocaust, most Jews in the world, if not becoming not Zionists, they became very pro. What would the word be? They were much more willing to go along with the Zionist program than they had ever been before, even though they themselves wanted to stay in America or stay in Britain or stay wherever. They were supportive of those who did want to go to Israel, and they understood that it was looked upon as a safe haven. This is the thing that people quite often don't understand, is that as long as the Jews were scattered to the nations, they had no legal right to arm and defend themselves like an army would. They didn't have the right to have a unified culture, unified language, unified religion, and so forth. The things that nations quite often have. They were scattered to the wind, and what David Ben-Gurion said, we committed the sin of weakness. We can never do that again. Our sin of weakness caused 6 million of our brethren to be murdered. We must never do that again. And that's why Israel has to, part of it is their geography. They don't have much room, so they have to be very defensive just to stay alive. But also, they learned from the Holocaust and from the pogroms and from the Inquisition and on that they could not let themselves be weak. They had to be strong. And so Eddie Jacobson came to that realization, and that pulled him into the whole question of what happens to the 1.5 million Jews who survived the Holocaust in Europe, who were still stuck in these terrible concentration camps.
Right. So you mentioned earlier Chaim Weizmann. So tell us about President Truman's first meeting with Chaim.
Well, what happened is the ambassador to the United States from Great Britain introduced Chaim Weizmann to Truman, which I think was providential, because that was Halifax, and he was not pro-Zionist at all. I think he was just realizing that there is a huge Jewish population in America, that the Jewish power center at that point had shifted from Central Europe and Russia over to America because all those Jews in Europe had been murdered. And so now America was the center of Jewish power. And Chaim Weizmann was the leading diplomat for the Zionist cause. And so he met with Truman and was actually somewhat concerned by Truman's position, because Truman said, I'm very concerned about this proposal that the new Jewish state will be a religious state and not a secular state. It will be Jewish only and not pluralistic democracy. And Chaim Weizmann said, that is a false rumor. That is not what it's going to be. It's going to be a modern, democratic, pluralistic society. Yes, we believe that the majority will be Jewish, but we will be open to whomever, is living there. Now, immigration was more of a different story. They were not as willing to have non-Jews immigrate, but anyone who lived there, who was peaceable and who would live under the law, they could stay. And they made that, the Zionists made that abundantly clear to the Arabs who were living on the western side of the Jordan River. Mm-hmm. And so Weizmann was so disturbed by some of the things that Truman had heard that were false that he ended up writing him a handwritten, I think it was 7 pages long
Wow.
letter addressing all of these issues. And later, Truman would say he so appreciated Chaim Weizmann in his intellect, but also in the diplomatic and respectful way that he carried himself. And that always left a very strong impression in Truman's heart. However, it wasn't enough to keep the doors open when tragedy did occur.
So, what happened that made President Truman so angry that he shut the doors to anyone who wanted to speak about Palestine?
Well, that's the tragedy I just referred to. What happened is that there were leading Jewish rabbis who were along with a few politicians who were the heads of the Zionist movement in America. And there were a couple of them who were brash and not very diplomatic, but they were extremely powerful. Now, there was a man a Jewish man who worked for FDR that was kept by Truman at the recommendation of Judge Rosenman, who had been one of FDR's friends and also Truman's friend. And he said, you want to keep this guy, David Niles. He's Jewish. He knows the Jewish American public. He knows the Zionist movement, but he also knows minority issues, and he would be very valuable. He was very valuable to FDR. I think he'll be valuable to him, or to you, Truman, as well. And so Truman did, and he very quickly clicked with David Niles. And so he would call Niles in and ask his advice. He was one of his chief advisors on Zionism and on Jewish affairs. And so Niles was there giving advice and helping him through. And so Harry would ask him, which of the rabbis do I need to speak to, and which can I avoid without political problems? Well, one of them was named Rabbi Silver, and he was very brash, but he was very powerful. And Niles said, he's hard to work with, but you have to work with him because he's got such a big following. And then the other person was Rabbi Wise, who was just like his name. He was very wise, very well-spoken, very diplomatic. Well, they all came in to speak with Truman, and Silver was bombastic and actually very derogatory in his speech to the president of the United States. And Truman was the type who believed in propriety, and he believed that there is protocol. And when you're speaking to the president, it didn't matter that it was Harry Truman. It would have been any president, that there needed to be respect. And so he was like, I'm not dealing with this person ever again. Silver had been so disrespectful. And so there was pressure coming from the Arabs. There was pressure coming from the State Department. There was pressure coming from the British. There was pressure coming from the Jews. There was pressure coming from the Christians who supported the Jews for the most part. And so Harry Truman was like, it is getting too much. And he slammed the doors shut and said, let the UN deal with it. I'm not going to talk to anyone else. Well, the problem was that the Zionists had come to the position where they realized that they had to divide Western Palestine, even though they were promised all of Palestine, the size of the state of Pennsylvania to begin with, in the Balfour Declaration. Then they lost 2/3 of that when Churchill gave Transjordan to the Arabs, and now they were going to lose half of what was left on the western side. And but they said, well, better this and having a home than nothing. And so the Zionists were willing to go along with this, but the vote was thrown into the brand new United Nations. And so the problem was that they didn't know whether Truman supported it or not. He never made that clear. He had supported the Jews as a senator, but now as president, that's a different deal. You're representing the entire nation, and he might have changed his mind. And the Zionists were panicking because the vote was coming up.
Right.
And they didn't know how. They tried everything. So they said, let's bring Chaim Weizmann over. We know that Truman likes him. So Chaim Weizmann came from Britain to the United States and stayed in a hotel in New York City waiting to get in. And David Niles did everything he could to get Chaim Weizmann in to meet with Truman. And Truman said, no, I'm not meeting with anyone. And he had been so hurt and upset by his treatment that he shut the doors, even to Chaim Weizmann, who he respected. So the Zionists are like, what are we going to do here?
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, how did the Zionists respond to this cold shoulder from Truman?
Well, they didn't know how to respond. They tried everything that they could. And then somebody said, hey, wait a second. I heard somewhere that Truman's best friend and former business partner is a Jew.
Eddie Jacobson, right?
Eddie Jacobson. And isn't it amazing how 25, 30 years before this, God was doing this work of building this relationship? Because the only person who could get in, who was Jewish, was Eddie Jacobson. So they called this lawyer who was a Zionist in Kansas City and said, we heard that there's a guy named Eddie Jacobson or something like that, and he's a friend of Truman's. We're trying to reach him. And he said, you mean Eddie Jacobson? Yeah, that's it. He said, do you know him? And the lawyer said, of course I know him. He's my client. And so he called him, and they got in touch between the Zionist and Jacobson. And the Zionist said to him, you've got to get in there. You're the only one who could talk to him. So Eddie paid his own way, flew from Kansas City to Washington, and walked into the White House unannounced. And he was like a brother to Truman, so he could do that. Right. And so Truman's secretary said, oh, hello. It's good to see you. Yeah, you could go in and say hi to the president. He doesn't have anybody in there. Just one thing, just don't talk about Palestine or the Jews or the Holocaust. And Eddie looked at the secretary and said, that's the only reason I'm here. And he turned and he walked into the Oval Office. And he sat down with Truman, and, they had small talk and how's your wife? How's the kids? All that kind of thing. And then Eddie told him why he was there. And he said, for the first time, he got the cold shoulder from his friend. And he gave him what was called icy diplomacy, where Truman talked nice to him, but it was very clear. He got rigid, he got testy, and he said, Eddie, I told everyone I'm not talking to anyone about this. And Eddie was like, but Harry, you need to talk to our people. We need to know where you stand. He said, I'm sorry, I'm not. And Eddie said at that moment, he thought, my best friend is the biggest anti-Semite in the world, which is quite something to say. Right, and Eddie got so upset that he actually had tears that formed in his eyes. He started dabbing the tears. And Truman said, now, Eddie, that's not fair, because he knew he was getting at his heart. Yeah. And Eddie was like, he was totally taken back. He didn't know what to do. And he's thinking, what can I say? What can I say? And then he looked over, and on a table next to the desk of Truman was a statue of Andrew Jackson. And it was the same. It was like a miniature of a statue that Harry had, as the county judge, had erected at the new county courthouse that he helped to build as a leader. And they gave him this miniature version of that statue. I've actually seen that statue in front of the courthouse in Independence, Missouri. And because they lived in Jackson County, and Jackson was one of Truman's heroes. So Eddie said, he got an idea, excuse me. And he said, Harry, all our lives, you've told me who your hero was. You said that Andrew Jackson was your hero throughout your life. I've heard you say that time and time again. He said, Harry, do you know who my hero is? And Harry was puzzled because they never had this conversation before. And he said, no, Eddie, who's your hero? And Eddie said, my hero is Chaim Weizmann. And he came here to America just to talk to you. He's an old man. He's sick. He's going blind. But he would go all the way to America just to talk to you about my people who have lost 6 million of our brethren, and you won't talk to them because some of our other leaders were rude to you? That doesn't sound like you, Harry. I thought you could take the heat in this office," which of course was one of Harry's slogans. If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, right?
Kitchen, yeah.
The buck stops here. He had that on his desk. So Eddie hit him with an arrow in the heart. So now Harry's like, and he turned his chair around and started tapping.
He knew the buttons to push.
Exactly right. And thank God he came up with that idea. So Harry starts tapping on his desk and looking out the window over the White House lawn. And it was a long pause. And Eddie started to sweat beads coming on his forehead. And he thought, I don't know, did I say the right thing? But then he thought, nah, I could tell I got to him. And so a moment later, Harry turns his chair back around and he says, "All right, you bald-headed bleepity bleep. Go ahead and set up the meeting with Chaim Weizmann. Only do this for me. Don't bring him in the main entrance. Sneak him in by whatever entrance it was that he told him to sneak him in so that the press won't see. And this will not be on the record. It will never be in the books that I met with him. And tell Chaim Weizmann that that's the only way that I will meet with him is if no one knows." That was a miracle. And so Chaim Weizmann was able to be snuck in by Eddie Jacobson into the White House. And they sat down and President Truman met with Chaim Weizmann, and Weizmann was able to answer his concerns again. And then they called Eddie to come in, and the three of them spoke for a while longer. And later on, I've actually seen this video. You can watch it on YouTube. Truman says it was in that meeting with Chaim Weizmann and Eddie Jacobson that he made his final decision to support the Jews having Eretz Israel as their homeland.
Wow. So what did Truman do to influence the vote on the partition of Palestine?
He never admits to this, but history tells us what he did. He had to be very careful to not look like he was putting his thumb on the scales. And yet he needed to put his thumb on the scales. In part because he needed to show that America was behind this. Because FDR always spoke out of both sides of his mouth to the Jews and the Arabs. So the world didn't know where America stood when Truman came into the White House. And now Truman was president, and he was charting his own course, breaking free from this kind of doublespeak that FDR had given. And so he had to do that carefully because he was not elected president. He was elected vice president, but he became president. And so he was trying to do this balancing act of upholding FDR's policies where he could. But then in cases like this, where FDR's policies were not good policies, he had to forge his own way. And so what had happened is there were some U.S. Allies who had come out against the Jews in the vote for partition in the UN. And so Truman called on the representatives, the U.S. representatives in the UN, to start going from delegation to delegation, and said, if need be, twist some arms. And so one of the people who was twisting arms, and I love this, was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of our delegates to the United Nations. And she was very pro-Zionist. And she was in there saying, listen, you want us to be behind you on certain votes? We need you to be behind us on this vote. And it was that pressure. Now, again, I've read Truman's memoirs, and he does not admit that he did this, but he did. And there are plenty of other people who say that he did, and there's plenty of evidence to show that he did. But he himself had to say, no, I didn't do that, what he actually did. So he had to, kind of play. You saw the same thing in the movie Lincoln, the Spielberg movie, where Lincoln had to show himself presidential. And so they hired these political operatives to make deals to get the votes for the 13th Amendment. Well, this was exactly the same thing. And oh, by the way, this happens to every president. Every president does this. but they can't show that they do it because they have to
Right.
look like they're, fair and honest and decent and all that
Right.
kind of stuff. So at any rate, that was the big thing. And it was Truman's last minute involvement that tipped the scales. And had he not been involved, the vote very most likely would have gone against the Jews, but it didn't.
Wow.
And partition was passed. And that was in November of 1947. And in May of 1948, the day that the British pulled out of their mandate in Palestine and their governor left and their warships left, David Ben-Gurion and the representatives of the Zionist movement stood up in the old library of Tel Aviv and declared Israel as a sovereign nation. And 12 minutes later, Harry Truman, this was the second big thing that he did. 12 minutes later, Harry Truman ordered that Israel be recognized on the floor of the United Nations. And so the United States became, because of Harry Truman, the United States became the first nation to recognize the new nation of Israel. And that, of course, caused many nations around the world to get behind them. And one by one, they started to recognize them. But the amazing thing was that the second nation to recognize Israel was the Soviet Union. And it happened only minutes after the U.S. made the recognition. And it surprised the Zionists and it surprised the world. And that gave a huge rush then for most of the nations of the world to very quickly recognize Israel.
Wow. So what happened in the later years between Harry and Eddie?
Well, when Harry left the White House, he moved back to Independence. And he was a man of the people, a very common person. He never owned his own home, ever, his whole life. He lived in his wife's parents' house while his mother-in-law was still alive. And then after she died, they stayed there. And it was his wife's house, really. I mean, it was his through marriage, but he never bought a house. And so that home, of course, you can go and tour. It was closed when I ever went. Every time I've gone, it's been closed, so I've never toured it. So I will really want to get back and tour the Truman House, although I have been to the Presidential Library and toured that museum and the archives. But so what would happen is that Harry continued to do what he had done as president and get up early in the morning and go for a several-mile walk. He called it his daily constitutional. And quite often, Eddie would join him when he could. They would go for walks, but they'd also have lunch together in downtown Kansas City. By this point, Eddie had his own men's clothing store, and I've actually gone to that store. It's now a bike shop, or at least it was the last time I was there, which it was in a part of Kansas City that had been restored. And so it was just lovely to see this old Art Deco building that once was Eddie Jacobson's store. And so they would go to lunch together and they planned this huge trip. They were going to go to England to visit Chaim Weizmann, or I'm sorry, by this time Weizmann was in Israel because he was the first president of Israel. But they were going to visit Churchill. They were going to go visit the Pope. Then they were going to go to Israel. And as they were planning this, sadly, Eddie Jacobson died of a heart attack.
Oh, wow.
And so neither Eddie or Harry ever went to Israel, which is really sad. And at the wake after Eddie's funeral, Harry said, he was more like a brother to me than anyone who was even my real brother. And I don't know how I'm going to live apart from him. So it's a very sweet friendship.
So last question for you, and this refers directly to your book. How did you come up with the title, I Am Cyrus?
Well, what happened is the year after Israel became a nation, and it became a nation in 1948. So in 1949, the chief rabbi of Israel came to the White House at the invitation of President Truman. And David Niles was there in the room and other people were there. And Harry asked, President Truman asked the chief rabbi, do you know what it is that I did to help in the rebirth of Israel? And Rabbi Herzog said, oh, yes, I know very well what you did. And it will always be a part of the annals of Jewish history, what you did. In fact, you were like the Cyrus of old. And just like Cyrus was placed in his mother's womb, you were placed in your mother's womb. And Harry Truman had tears in his eyes. And he got up from behind the big oak desk in the Oval Office, and he walked around and got right into the rabbi's face and said, do you really believe this? And the rabbi said, yes, you were born for this purpose. What a thing to say. He said, like
Absolutely.
Cyrus of old, you were born for this purpose. So a few years went by, and Truman finished out his term, and he left office in January of 1953. And not long after that, he was invited to speak at the Jewish seminary in New York City. And they asked Eddie Jacobson to introduce him, which was very appropriate. By now, Eddie Jacobson had become a hero in the Zionist movement. In fact, there was talk at one point of Eddie becoming the first ambassador to Israel from the United States. But he said, no, I'm not qualified. But that's
I just run a clothing store.
Exactly. And that's how much people admired what he did and how much they knew this story that I'm telling right now. And so they invited Eddie to introduce Harry at the Jewish seminary. And so Eddie said, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you my friend who helped in the rebirth of Israel, President Harry Truman. And everybody clapped. Harry got up and he waited for the applause to die down. And he turned back to Eddie and he said, what do you mean helped? He said, I am Cyrus. I am Cyrus. So that's why I call the book I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel.
Awesome. That's a cool story, and that's a good wrap, a good bow tie on this conversation.
Amen. Well, we want to thank each one of you who have watched this program, and remind you that we are here every Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Stories and Myths. If you would like to buy your own copy of I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel, you can get this at Amazon.com, or you could go to my website, vonbuzik.com, and it's also available wherever books are sold. If you have a local bookstore, you can go and ask them to order it for you, and also ask them to put it on the shelves so that other people will see this book. When I wrote this book, John, I did so with two purposes in mind. One was to write a defense of the rebirth of Israel in such a thorough manner that it could be defended before the Supreme Court. And so there's 1,200 endnotes here to defend what my positions are in this book. The other thing that I wanted to do was write it in a way that people could read it. And even though it's kind of a thick book, people have told me that it's relatively, not easy, but smooth reading, that it's a page turner is what they've told me. And you could go on to Amazon and see the people who have given endorsements to the book. And nearly all of them have said that both it was easy to read, but also that they learned things. And I just heard this again. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Florida, and this very learned man, a pastor, walked up and said, I just finished reading I Am Cyrus, and I learned things in that book. He said, I thought I knew the whole story of the Zionist movement and the rebirth of Israel, but I learned things I didn't know before by reading I Am Cyrus. So check this out at vonbuzik.com, Amazon.com, where you could get my other books like Nobody Knows, the Harry T. Burley story, and Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, and other books. And you can get the book by John C. Farrell, which is called
The Official NASCAR Trivia Book, which is right here.
And it is available on Amazon.com. So once again, thank you so much for being here. Hey, if you enjoy this program, please share it with others. And would you please go to my YouTube channel? Just type in my name in YouTube, Craig Von Buzik, and subscribe to that YouTube channel, and then put the mark saying notify me when new videos are released. That will help me to get to the point where I can change the YouTube channel name from Gobbledygook, which is what it is right now. It's literally YouTube Gobbledygook, to actually my name, so that people will know that it's my stuff and so forth. So if you would like to support what we're doing, please subscribe to our to my YouTube channel and check out John, we're up to, I think this is episode 24.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
That is crazy.
So we are cranking. So yes, thank you once again to each one of you who have joined with us. We're so glad that you're with us. We're going to be in the next couple of months expanding this into an audio version that's going to be available on all the different platforms like Apple and the other audio platforms for downloading, and then also expanding with video. We have a lot of exciting things coming up. I actually have 3 books coming out now. I just got a contract today, John, for a book.
Wow.
So I've got 3 new books coming out in 2022. So it's an exciting time, and you help to make it possible with your support. So we will see you again here next Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, for Stories and Myths. For John C. Farrell, I'm Craig Von Buzik. We'll see you same bat time, same bat channel. Take care.